to you, Erky. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you everybody for the generous giving of your time to this process. I think the brief has been set out very clearly by both the Presidency and the Office of the Premier. For our purposes, the acronym TRAM applies. It's about transformation, honest to goodness structural change in the way we think about the city. It's about reindustrialization. The West Rand particularly has become a flagging region with the demise of the mining industry, etc. We desperately need to reindustrialize this area. Making things adaptable and resilient is fundamental to this world of future-proofing, where change is the constant, and it's a speeded up constant. And then, of course, modernization and becoming part of a much bigger world and subscribing to international best practice and pushing the edges of what that best practice means at any given time. I'm going to switch off the video and share, and this is the point where we need to be clear that we're all seeing the same thing. There we go. Am I right in saying that people can see what's on the screen and they can see my cursor moving?
Yes, we can see that.
Yeah. Fine, great, all right. If anybody can't, and also as we get into the later parts of this discussion, particularly around health and facilities and schooling, a lot more of that is quite dense argument line rather than graphic stuff. So please don't stress about the amount of words and things, because as Naomi said, this will be distributed for discussion. Thanks very much. So the area we're looking at is, as shown in that black dotted line, that's our overall study area. So quite apart from the fact that we're looking to do a very compact, complex, smart city, we are having to look at a much bigger region. Could you excuse me for 1 second, please? I've got a noise competitor in the background. Man.
Well, at least Erky doesn't have to compete with the Hardy-Dars as he did at the last meeting. So we'll give him a few minutes to quieten the rabble rousers in his office, I take it, or his home. Are you back with us, Erky?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted on top of that. It's more sensible to take on the Hardy-Dars than one's wife around this noise issue. So our area is a vast region that deals with the outer fringe of the greater Gauteng city region. And it's an area that has been looked at for a long time to get more out of it from an urban development point of view, but it's been held back on one hand by lack of infrastructure, and largely that lack of infrastructure has been because of the fact that the study area covers a whole range of jurisdictional areas, and so it never gets concentrated attention as a region in its own right. So there we have, for example, sorry, I'm not sure why. There we go. The city of Johannesburg covers a portion of our study area. The city of Magadi City covers another portion off to the west. And then Tshwane have the northern tip of this whole piece. On top of that all, there's a provincial boundary involved between Northern Province and Gauteng, and the adjacent municipality within Northern Province is Madibeng. So all of these are participants in this, and on top of that all, with the Presidency and the Premier's office and these respective cities and local jurisdictions, we also have the DBSA on board. So it's a fantastic conglomerate of people. In the broader city region sense, this is roughly the area we're dealing with here. That's Lanseria, airport, obviously. It's got Northgate, it's got Cosmos City, it's got Diepsloot. All of that is a very interesting piece, because in many respects, although we've got quite a lot of development out there, a lot of it is marginalized development that is finding a need to be integrated into a much bigger urban mainstream and to participate in an urban economy. At the moment, it's true to say that a lot of the people out in Diepsloot and Cosmos City sit very dislocated from urban prospect, so to speak. So part of the intention of the whole smart city is not simply to do a smart city, but it's to do it with the intent of bringing a really powerful logic to this marginalized fringe of the urban system. And in looking at that, if we look at the northwestern quadrant of the Gauteng city region, we've got Johannesburg CBD there, we've got Tshwane, we've got Magadi City. There's always been this Randstad developing between Tshwane and Johannesburg, predicated on Midrand, and we've got the traditional old West Rand corridor running out to Magadi City or Krugersdorp. We also in this have this very big piece of traffic infrastructure, I guess, in the form of the N14 that stretches from Magadi City to Tshwane. And then coming from Johannesburg, we've got Malibongwe Drive that leads out and morphs into Pelindaba Road, which goes beyond Lanseria, links us through the Hartbeespoort Dam area to Brits and Rustenburg beyond. And it's that point of congruence of Malibongwe and the N14 that we look to make this intervention of the new smart city and help regionalize this fringe. So, sitting in a pub with your mate, this is the back of the cigarette box, and the way we describe it is that we've got this road from Johannesburg to the dam. We've got this radial freeway with a lot of capacity in the N14, and we've got Lanseria Airport. What we've had over many years is, of course, an evolving urban corridor that's growing out along Malibongwe Drive, but there's a lot of baggy interstitial space in all of this, and in many respects, what's happened in that interstitial space has become somewhat marginalized urban sprawl, and we need to make sense of that. We have fantastically these things that constrain us in our urban sprawl, because what we're trying to do is the antithesis of urban sprawl. And so the cradle of humankind and its World Heritage Site, the agricultural potential of that area, the remarkable recreational value of the Daspoort, the Timeball and the Magaliesberg mountain ranges, the dam itself, all of these things are a great reason not to be sprawling and to contain yourself. We have the same thing applies across to the northeast in Tshwane in the form of the Renosterspruit Reserve and other very important open space allocations there. So it's our ambition in that kind of a context to develop energy off this corridor that leads out towards the dam and to pick up on the strength of this N14 piece of infrastructure, which is one of the few bits of mega infrastructure in the area, incidentally. And then, of course, we've got the airport as not our best friend, it's our only friend when you think of it from an economic driver point of view. And it's that context then that we look to see how do we make infrastructural investment in this, so you can liken it in a sense to a development trellis on which the city can consolidate itself, and how do we introduce into that a whole range of economic propositions so that we cease to look at this as an opportunity to lead housing into the area, but rather lead economic opportunity around which housing then starts to make sense. And then we can honestly talk about the consolidation of a smart city that does a whole lot of things of tying and bolting this part of the urban system in place. And so here's this vast region going well beyond Gauteng, and as you can see, our area sitting there with a relatively under-serviced kind of infrastructure, other than the N14 running through it. And that shows in the urban response where we in effect almost sit in something of a development vacuum out to the northwest of Johannesburg there. And it's because it's this crossover area. Wherever you come from, it's always on the outer fringes of somewhere, and we've got to turn it into a place in its own right. So there we have Lanseria Airport. Over there, we've got the N14, is the blue route going diagonally through our whole study area. The study area, just by indication, is about a 25-minute drive in all directions from that Lanseria Airport. So it's a vast system, and apart from us making a smart city in it, we've got to define what the smart hinterland of that city is from a regional point of view. And there you can see Cosmo City, Diepsloot, Steyn City, etc. Rustenburg sits over here. So in making our first bits of accessibility more obvious to this area, we're looking at how to build on what's there rather than introduce a whole lot of new stuff. And that means probably upgrading Malibongwe quite dramatically in the shorter term, and at the same time looking at how do we deliver public transport with that. Fundamentally, as we grow this place and the entire city region, we know that we're not going very far in trying to do this with private mobility and motor cars. We've got to be thinking of transportation on a whole nother level. And so if that's initially only going to deliver a priority lane, let's say for taxis, then that's where it might be. If that can morph into a BRT, so much the better. And if that becomes a light rail or anything else beyond that, all of this is the way we need to think about a city that evolves. And we know that if we have a huge crisis in capacity from a road point of view, we do have all these designated routes in place that are entrenched in the Gauteng strategic road network, and in this case the PWV3, as indicated there, obviously has an ability to not only add a lot of value to our area, but certainly to take a lot of pressure off anything that might be starting to get out of hand on Malibongwe. And so there's the bigger system. You would imagine we've got more roads per square meter here than anywhere else on Earth, but the reality, of course, is that the majority of these roads aren't built yet. The number of dotted lines is all the stuff that is reserved, but it's not built. And so we rely heavily on that, not just as a road resource, but understanding it now more and more as a transportation resource that keeps us open-ended for public transport and many other uses within that. We were discussing earlier today the smart city. That kind of road system is one of the most important things from the point of view of how we roll out smart infrastructure as well. But very importantly in all of this, of course, is probably our best early opportunity to deliver public transport into this whole study area is Gautrain. And if you look at that red line with the dot there, that's Sandton on the existing part of the Gautrain line. The very next first phase of Gautrain's expansion is in fact to go from Sandton to Randburg and out to Little Falls, and coming off that a spur, that's sorry, wrong way, that takes us up to Cosmo City. And you can see that stage one or phase one then of the Gautrain expansion actually brings a lot of delivery into the southern portion of our study area. But for us, it's critical to try and see if we can make that extension of Cosmo City link up to the airport and to deliver people there as public transport. Gautrain have told us that they see that only as their phase 5, but they make it quite clear that it's a bums on seats kind of proposition. If we can justify more bums earlier, they'll bring that forward if it can be justified. We would like to take the view, and of course this is our wish, and it's a matter we still have to take further with Gautrain, that we would like to see them as a city building agent, given that it is in fact a provincial initiative, and that if we could deliver that line sooner rather than later, we would have done two things. We would have achieved a connection between Lanseria Airport and OR Tambo Airport from a public transport point of view, and we would have delivered a passenger line out to this new smart city, not as a retrofit because there are enough people there now, but actually to drive this new urban system that we're looking to create diagrammatically in that way. If we look at what's available to us in the area, there's a vast amount, and our whole essence is to try and restrict the amount of land we need for as long as we need so that we can get this thing on steroids and working in a very powerful, intense way. But if one looks at the land that is developed or can be developed with very little constraint, it more or less distills into that portion of the study area, which is a vast area. It's consolidating whole pieces of Johannesburg's outer lying areas. It's also consolidating pieces of Mogale City as a corridor on the N14. But that really represents the focus of what we've got to get right. And if we're going to do that justice and do it responsibly, we're going to have to understand what it is that we do in this area. So we know there's an enormous amount of pressure on housing in all of this. And I want to say thank you that we've had the pleasure of meeting a lot of the people from Human Settlements, from National Housing Agency, etc., over our discussions. And what we're really now able to come back to you with is our thinking around earlier discussions that we've had. And so this represents some of the formalized human settlements issues and some of the what were earlier informal settlements that have now expanded somewhat over time. But that's really the state of play for our study area from a housing point of view at the moment. What has been identified in our study area as priority housing areas is as shown here. And so there's obviously a lot of land that's been looked or set aside and promulgated in this area. And there's equally around the Mulder's Drift area to the north of Lanseria Airport itself, a substantial amount of land that's been identified there. 11 Oudtsbos and this portion of the extension of Diepsloot, in fact, sit outside of our area, but of course we take it into account as a very real factor within our bigger sphere of influence. If we look at land holdings, and as I said, people have been looking to develop out here for about the last 15 to 20 years. Several planning initiatives have come and gone, mostly limited by the fact that there isn't bulk service, and bulk service equally being indicative of the fact that there's multi-jurisdiction and a lack of, if you like, common purpose out in this area. But nevertheless, quite substantial land holdings have been assembled over the years, and what is indicated here is anything over 50 hectare land holding, and you can see some of them are huge. The eye immediately goes, of course, to the big, what one could refer to as the red herring, because that's not actually available as a piece of land for urban development. It's the Northern Farms area of Johannesburg, and it's fundamentally part of this whole system of what we increasingly start to talk about as water resource centers rather than wastewater treatment plants, which is what sewage farms used to be called. We now understand them to have a huge amount more value in terms of the water we can resource from that and take into proper purpose. So that is an area that we see actually as an agri-hub, more of that in a moment. But you can see that's the airport holding in there at the moment. But very sizable chunks have been put together by province and others, but a lot of it very, very much in anticipation of urban development out in this area. The townships that we know of, and this is all work in progress still, there may be others, and what's also very hard to track is whether a lot of the townships that are in the process are still actually being applied for, whether they've lapsed. And so we're having to make sense of that, but in many respects these townships down here are sort of, if you like, housing driven in many respects. And then, of course, what we have out in this area, sitting just off our plan it's in our study area, though, is the Riverside View mega project that has delivered at the moment about 6,000 houses that are occupied, and another about 10,000 or so. I think it's 20,000 all up. About 2,000 of the apartments have already been delivered in all of that. So it's a very big scheme just to the north of Steyn City and just below the northern outfall waterworks, or the Northern Farms kind of piece. The other piece that's just outside of our area but is important in the wider order of things is the Diepsloot East proposal to expand Diepsloot to the eastern side of William Nicol. And obviously all of that comes into play at a bigger picture here in terms of what we're dealing with. But in doing this, we're driven, of course, heavily by the precepts of sustainability. And sustainable urbanism for us is not simply a green agenda, and nor is a smart city a city of gizmos and tech-heavy kind of investment. It's a whole bunch of things that have to be understood holistically if we're going to make a significant penetration into this. It's got to be compact in extent, meaning we concentrate on walking distance and the walkable city. But it's also got to be complex in its pattern. It's got to have a mixed-use, intense, dense profile, and it's the antithesis of sprawl, as I say. So compact complexity is the nature of the city we look at. And it has to be structured on social integration, spatially inclusionary, democratic. It's, of course, got to, through its smartness, it's got to give access to many, many people in that technology as well. And that means also how we accommodate people's local economies and how we get beyond the centralist economy that swallows everything up and rather look at how we achieve the complexity of dual logic economies. We know we're not going very far without public transport, but it's more than simply taxis and buses. It's actually about mass transit systems and how we feed off those systems. And fundamentally, of course, we've got to reduce the need to commute. If we look at things in a way that people live, work, pray, and play in the same place, we have then reduced the need to commute, and we can really seriously make inroads on non-motorized transport as the default of the movement system. But where you don't find non-motorized transit being able to bring you to where you need to be, you should have public transport as an affordable, safe alternative. As I say, the green agenda, as important as it is one of the underpinnings. And so having an underlay to all of this, which is ecologically sound and deals with a healthy biodiversity, has to be fundamental to the sustainability. And it's only then we can start talking about urban efficiency. And urban efficiency comes out of the way we pattern things and how we put spaces together. There's a huge diseconomy in the way Gauteng City region operates from an energy efficiency point of view at the moment, simply because it is so spread and sprawled and dislocated. And then, of course, it's possible to talk sensibly about waste to energy and the many other things that go with the energy efficient side of smart cities. So smart city infrastructure, we've spoken about, it's not just gizmos, it's much more than that. And of course, the way the world's moving, and bearing in mind that cities are effectively just about how do we consume effectively, we've got to have an understanding of the next generation logistics hubs that are coming into play around the perimeter of the Gauteng City region, and we believe this is one such opportunity. And understanding too that we're not doing business as usual in terms of just designing infrastructure for some target population sometime in the distance. It's a question of how do we deal with the management of thresholds and the risk control around those thresholds, and dealing with services that are appropriate to what we're doing rather than following in many respects archaic standards or technologies that are now starting to dwindle as other technologies take over. One of the most important in that regard, incidentally, is in sanitation and sewering, and how we go to far less water-dependent kind of polluting approaches. And then to remember that Agriculture is not something that happens over the hill and far away in a rural area. It's actually fundamentally part of the urban economy. And we sit right here on the edge of 30 million people as a market over the next 30 to 40 years. And we need to understand that and a real economic base that this region can provide for us. So there's where we elect the city centre to be effectively at the interchange of Malibongwe Drive crossing the N14 and looking at this sort of inner focus area that we're closer to in our study area. And that in many respects comes out of earlier work done by province in developing the Lanseria Regional Strategic Development Policy. And it's a policy framework and document that guides us very heavily. It's very much a polynucleated system, very strongly tied together by urban structure in the form of urban corridors, urban activity spines, and very strong connectivity. In many respects, that idea of the capital web around which the 1,000 designers will consolidate. If we focus in on the piece that we are starting to see more particularly as the smart city, this is pretty much indicative of that. And if we look at that from a scheduling point of view, that's pretty much the development framework as it's evolving at the moment through the work we're doing, and that's changing incrementally all the time. But it schedules up to very big numbers. And so whereas people thought this was going to be a big opportunity, it's in fact a groot opportunity. It's a huge opportunity, and it yields very big numbers. If we do this correctly with mixed use, high intensity, urban structure and urban fundamental drivers, then we can put all these things together with freight and logistics, with industrial stuff, with airport related uses, with commercial and warehousing stuff. Housing and the residential component becomes part of the glue that knits all this together. It's not the leader into this region. And the housing that comes early, we seriously want to encourage that it should be about structuring this new city before we start to sprawl and do infill beyond that essential urban structure. And so we're always nervous about reporting these sort of numbers. You'll see that without trying very hard, we add 15,000 hectares of new urban land into the system, and that's very easy at various density assumptions to arrive at 850,000 units, and that very easily equates to 3 million to 3.5 million people, as Tim Nest said earlier. And so here's the real concern. This isn't licking our lips and saying this is where we come and solve all the housing backlog issues. It's about how do we get in, and why we're so keen to be talking with SHRA and all the social housing agencies and these people who are now doing mega projects but realizing that they need to be doing them at even greater intensity. And we've spoken to a couple of those people, and we really welcome the support they seem to be given for this idea of structuring a smarter city with less sprawl. And so that being the overall framework, that gives us a basis to provide for a future urban corridor linking down into Mogale City. It gives us urban structuring of the corridor across northeast to Tshwane, and it allows us then to consolidate this whole portion of Mogale City and Johannesburg around a new core. And in that, a very important part of this, and it's just one particular area that we focus on by example, and that is to turn that into an agri-tech hub where it's about agricultural processing, but it's also about production because of the amount of water we have there through the northern outfall sewer works, etc., and all the new investment that has to come into sanitation in this area. That's a very powerful area in which we look at high intensity agriculture, agri-villages and all of that. But of course the whole area itself is very rich with water and aquifers. It's not great on soils because of the granites, but it is, and thankfully we are not overly endowed with the dolomites, which mostly sit to the north in this region over here, in a big girdle around there. But all of this does have a great deal of agricultural potential as a whole new piece of the economy to this region, allied to which we have the heritage, tourism, and recreational value of this whole area. So all of that agricultural thing must be seen as part of a bigger piece of green, which in turn, of course, regionally goes way beyond this to a much bigger piece of sustainability beyond that in the urban breadbasket of Gauteng City region. So if we look at that, and I'll very quickly take us to the urban core of that, we look to build this on taking Lanseria Airport. We take on board their idea of a potential future second runway and a midfield new terminal. We look at our urban system really favouring the intersection down at Maribongwe and the N14, and we look at a big institutional node that potentially grows out here as well in the form of bigger convention centres, World Trade Centres. There's even been speak by some people of the Pan-African Parliament that failed to take hold in Midrand some years ago might move into a position here. And then all of that glued together by this commercial and freight and logistics kind of stuff that combines our new city with the airport, and then always this potential for further growth beyond the airport in allied related things to the airport. But again, very carefully, we'd really rather not be taking housing into that kind of area because it's taking us too far away from our knitting, which is to make this the area of urban prospect in there. So that's the way it starts to stack up diagrammatically at the moment, with the majority of the urban core sitting in and around here, if you like, the porridge of the town centre bleeding northwards to link up with the airport over here. And all of this looking, as one does, to the open space system that underpins it all, the non-motorized transit routes that feed a network across all of that, a road network that is also a public transport network. It sets out the key activity zones, and it provides for the early arrival of things like the Rio via a shuttle system and Gautrain, potentially giving us a central station over in this position over here before moving on up to the airport. And diagrammatically, that's what it looks like as this integrated thing where everything is based on this idea of several overlaying public transport things. Very important as a perspective in all of this is to realize that although we're looking at what happens over the next 5, 10 and 15 years, 50, 60, 80 and 100 years is a blink of an eye in a city's life. And what we're doing here has to be done enormously responsibly because effectively we're talking about shaping the earth in a way that this endures for several millennia, which is the nature of cities. And so having this isn't a master plan about showing exactly how things work in detail. It's about showing how you reserve all of these possibilities in a very fast changing kind of world. But the importance of Gautrain in this cannot be overemphasized, and we certainly hope we come to terms with early delivery of that rather than waiting for that to just arrive as the fifth phase. Put that out, then that's the, if you like, the guts of the movement system. It's how we place then the urban core, our institutional core, and how we make for expanded urban core around that existing infrastructure. And how do we put as little in as possible to sweat as much early, and then it's possible to start talking about how we add on and using things like Stain City, using Cosmos City, then it's sensible to start talking about how we take a corridor down the highway to Magadi City and how we take a corridor along the highway to Tshwane, and then urban infill around that. And bear in mind a huge amount of the restriction on coming and going of the airport in terms of noise contours, etc., that a lot of this goes to, if you like, the more robust industrial and distribution industry kind of things. And it's probably in this area we would hope to get a rail platform into this whole thing as well. So that is all held very strongly by this green girdle of economy that we think of beyond our urban limits, and that is what we refer to as the green yoke that weighs down on us, and we're very happy to have that pressing down on us and limiting our ability to sprawl. And so there's the overall framework as it is now, and that's probably the springboard then for further discussion. It's in a way, this presentation has given now the overview of the city and the housing dynamic of it all. There's a whole nother piece to this that we want to explore with this forum as well, which is this issue of the delivery of health, education, and social facilities into all of this in a sustainable way. I'm happy to say that we've got Tando with us as one of our specialists in our team. She's online with us, and she'll be able to speak to details as well as we go forward. Nomi, I wanted to say that if we want to possibly pause it here and take discussion around housing and housing allied issues, that might be more sensible before we press on into what are really allied but quite different issues around delivery in terms of health, education, and social facilities. Would that be a sensible way to think about it?
Yes, I think that could work, Erky. Thank you very much. So